something unusual is happening in 2026. Not one crisis, not two, a convergence. Political, economic, technological, and geopolitical, arriving simultaneously, feeding each other and accelerating faster than governments can respond. Americans are watching a president govern with approval ratings hovering around 41%, disapproval above 56%. The Democratic Party sits at essentially the same favorability numbers as the Republican Party. Nearly half the country identifies as independent, the largest bloc in the electorate, yet has no viable political home. At the same time, a hiring freeze is spreading silently through the American economy. Jobs that aren't being posted, entry-level roles that have quietly disappeared. Young workers in their 20s finding that the rungs of the career ladder they were supposed to climb simply no longer exist. And above all of this, a world that is coming apart at the seams. A war in Iran, a fracturing NATO, a China-Russia axis waiting and watching, a Middle East that refuses to stabilize, and a global financial system that hasn't fully reckoned with what happens when the country that underwrites the entire order starts pulling back. This video is about all of it, and more importantly, it's about how all of it connects. Let's start at home, because domestic political capacity is the prerequisite for everything else. The argument for a third major political party in the United States has never been stronger. Not on ideological grounds, but on structural ones. 40 to 45% of Americans call themselves independents. That is not a fringe. That is the largest voting bloc in the country, and it currently has no direct representation. The case for a third party rests on something simple. When people vote against the other side rather than for their own, the system stops producing legitimate governance. It produces managed stalemate, punctuated by whichever side generates more fear. Ranked choice voting is spreading at the state level. If adopted federally, it removes the spoiler effect that has kept third parties from gaining traction for a century. But the structural barriers, winner-take-all districts, the Electoral College, ballot access laws designed to protect incumbents, remain enormous. The realistic near-term scenario is not a third party winning the White House. It is a third party or independent coalition winning enough congressional seats to hold meaningful leverage in a closely divided chamber. That's not nothing. In a 50-50 Senate, 5 independent senators can dictate the terms of every negotiation. The deeper problem, though, is that neither major party currently has a coherent answer to the set of challenges the country actually faces. Not in any sustained, serious way. The Democrats have institutional credibility, but no galvanizing vision. The Republicans have a populist energy, but are governing through a set of 20th century policy tools. Tariffs, border walls, energy dominance, applied to 21st century problems that those tools weren't designed to solve. The country is politically available for something new. The question is whether the structural barriers fall before the window closes. Here is what is actually happening in the American economy right now, and why the official unemployment statistics are missing it. Companies are not firing people at scale. They are doing something more insidious. They are using artificial intelligence to absorb growing workloads without adding headcount. A team of 12 becomes a team of 8, not through layoffs, but through attrition that is never backfilled. 2 positions are quietly folded into automated workflows. The job that would have been posted simply isn't. Gartner calls this headcount containment. The result doesn't register as unemployment. It registers as a career that never starts. A job that is never advertised. A promotion that goes to an algorithm instead of a person. The generational damage is severe and specific. Unemployment among workers aged 20 to 30 in technology-exposed occupations has risen nearly 3 percentage points since early 2025. The entry-level on-ramp, the first job, the first real paycheck, the beginning of building career capital, is disappearing. Not suddenly, gradually, quietly. A Duke University study found that roughly 44% of businesses intend to make AI-related workforce reductions in 2026. A separate survey found that nearly 60% of hiring managers plan layoffs, with AI cited as the leading cause. And Anthropic's own CEO has warned publicly that AI could eliminate half of all entry-level white-collar jobs within 5 years. The institutional economists, Goldman Sachs, the IMF, the World Economic Forum, maintain that AI will create more jobs than it destroys over the long run. They are probably right at the macro level. The problem is that macro-level job creation does not help the 24-year-old who cannot get a call back today, in this economy, in this hiring market. There's a gap between when jobs are destroyed and when new ones are created. That gap is where political radicalization lives. Here is the political dimension that almost nobody is discussing. Neither the Republican nor the Democratic Party has a serious, credible, detailed answer to AI-driven labor disruption. Not one. Republicans talk about tariffs and manufacturing reshoring, industrial-era tools applied to a post-industrial problem. Democrats talk about retraining programs, slow, abstract, and historically ineffective at scale. Neither party is meeting the moment. The candidate or movement that speaks directly and credibly to this disruption, not with platitudes, but with concrete mechanisms, has a genuine political opening. That opening is growing every quarter. The World Economic Forum's Global Risks Report for 2026 named geoeconomic confrontation the single risk most likely to trigger a global crisis this year, ranking it number 1 for the first time above armed conflict, above climate, above pandemics. That framing matters. The most dangerous threat is not military, it is economic warfare, the weaponization of trade, technology, supply chains, and currency being conducted simultaneously across multiple fronts. In Europe, the most dangerous front has shifted, not the trenches of Ukraine, the hybrid war between Russia and NATO. Putin's strategy is no longer to win militarily. It is to erode European political will before economic constraints force him to the table. Every month Ukraine does not collapse is a month Russia bleeds. But every month NATO fractures is a month Russia gains. In the Middle East, the Iran war has reshuffled but not resolved the underlying dynamics. The Strait of Hormuz, the artery through which a third of the world's seaborne oil passes, has been the battleground. China and Russia have been providing behind-the-scenes intelligence and logistics support to Iran, not because they want Iran to win, but because a prolonged conflict depletes American interceptor missile stockpiles, drains treasury resources, and divides the Western alliance. This is strategic patience as military strategy. In East Asia, the Taiwan Strait remains the most dangerous flashpoint on the planet. China's People's Liberation Army has experienced internal purges. The Central Military Commission was reduced from 7 members to 2 in January 2026, creating dangerous uncertainty about command and control at exactly the moment when miscalculation risk is highest. The window for Chinese military adventurism over Taiwan is probably this decade, because by the 2030s, China's demographic and economic trajectory makes sustained military campaigns much harder to sustain. And in the Western Hemisphere, Venezuela has become a proxy battleground, a strategic foothold for China and Russia that the United States has responded to by invoking a 21st century version of the Monroe Doctrine. Here is the thread connecting all of these flashpoints. The United States is simultaneously the indispensable actor in every one of them, and a country whose domestic political and economic dysfunction is actively degrading its capacity to manage any of them coherently. The world does not have a substitute for American leadership. It has China, which is willing to fill vacuums, but not to build the kind of rules-based architecture that produced 75 years of unprecedented prosperity. It has Russia, which is a declining power, playing offense with diminishing resources. And it has a fractured Europe that is only now, under the pressure of American disengagement, beginning to build the autonomous security capacity it should have built 30 years ago. The question of whether the United States should pivot away from NATO and toward a tighter Western Hemisphere alliance has moved from the fringes of strategic debate to the center of actual policy. The 2026 U.S. National Defense Strategy explicitly names the Western Hemisphere as the primary regional priority, above Europe, above the Middle East. The Trump administration has called NATO a paper tiger and is actively discussing withdrawal, triggered by European allies' refusal to join the Iran operation. The instinct behind a hemispheric pivot is not without logic. The Americas collectively hold the world's largest oil reserves, massive lithium and copper deposits, critical for the AI and electrification economy, enormous agricultural capacity, and geographic insulation from the Eurasian power struggles that have consumed American resources for a century. A self-sufficient Western Hemisphere, bound by shared supply chains, shared digital infrastructure, and shared energy policy, is not a fantasy. More importantly, on the K-shaped economy problem, a coordinated hemispheric industrial policy could theoretically redirect investment into shared manufacturing, AI governance, and clean energy in ways that create broadly distributed jobs rather than concentrating gains at the top. That is the version of economic nationalism that actually addresses inequality, rather than simply protecting incumbent industries. But here is where the strategy breaks down. In practice, Canada's new government came to power explicitly on a sovereignty-first platform, in direct response to American economic coercion. Mexico is navigating cartel power, fentanyl politics, and the collapse of predictable North American trade simultaneously. You cannot build a cooperative hemisphere alliance on a foundation of tariff threats and bilateral pressure. Partners have to choose to join, and the cost of abandoning NATO at this particular moment is historically underappreciated. NATO is not just a military arrangement. It is the architecture of Western deterrence, the reason Russia has never tested Article 5, the reason Europe's long peace lasted 75 years, the reason nuclear arsenals stayed in their silos. Dismantling it without a successor framework does not free the United States from European entanglements. It creates a vacuum that fills with exactly the instability that makes the rest of the strategic agenda impossible. The wiser path, harder politically, but strategically coherent, is to force European strategic autonomy while maintaining the collective defense guarantee. Push Europe to fund and lead its own security, but keep the backstop. That preserves deterrence, without the United States subsidizing every European foreign policy choice. Let us be honest about what China, Russia, and the United States actually want, because the path to avoiding kinetic war runs through understanding incentive structures, not through wishful thinking about shared values. China does not want a war with the United States. It wants Taiwan reunification on its terms, dominance of the Indo-Pacific maritime commons, and enough economic space to complete its transition to a high-technology economy, before demographic and debt pressures constrain its options. War with the United States risks all three. The 2026 U.S. National Defense Strategy explicitly tells Beijing that the American goal is not to humiliate or strangle China, and that protecting U.S. interests does not require regime change. That is an offer. Whether Beijing takes it is the central strategic question of this decade. Russia does not want a war with NATO. It wants a sphere of influence in its near abroad, relief from economic sanctions, and acknowledgement that it remains a great power, worthy of serious diplomatic engagement. The Alaska summit between Trump and Putin in 2025 showed there is a diplomatic channel. The question is whether it can be formalized before the window closes. And hardliners on both sides make de-escalation politically impossible. North Korea is the most dangerous, precisely because its calculus is different. Kim Jong-un's regime has a single overriding objective: survival. Nuclear capability is the guarantee of that survival. The path to North Korean de-escalation runs not through denuclearization. That ship has sailed, but through building enough economic interdependence and security assurance that first strike calculations shift away from offensive use. China is the only actor with meaningful leverage here, which makes the US-China relationship the precondition for Korean Peninsula stability. What would a genuine peace architecture look like? It would have to operate on 4 simultaneous tracks. First, the economic track. The K-shaped global economy is the root fuel for instability. Populations experiencing stagnant wages, AI-driven job displacement, and eroding middle classes generate the political pressure that pushes governments toward nationalist aggression abroad. A shared growth framework, not charity, but structured economic cooperation that gives all major powers a stake in stability, is the only long-term answer. China wants trade normalization and tariff relief. Russia wants Ukraine resolution and sanctions relief. Those are the opening bids of a negotiation the United States has the leverage to shape. Second, the military diplomatic track. The most urgent need is replacing the arms control architecture that has been systematically dismantled. The last US-Russia strategic arms treaty has expired. Both nuclear arsenals are now entirely unconstrained, for the first time since the early Cold War. An unconstrained three-way nuclear arms race between the United States, Russia, and a rapidly expanding Chinese arsenal is the fastest path to accidental catastrophe, not through intent, but through miscalculation. Rebuilding that architecture is not weakness. It is the most basic form of self-interest. Third, the technological track. AI is simultaneously the greatest economic disruptor and the greatest potential source of common ground. A US-China AI governance agreement, even a narrow one, covering safety standards and mutual non-weaponization of certain capabilities, would accomplish two things simultaneously: managing the economic disruption that is feeding political radicalization in both countries, and removing one of the most dangerous future escalation vectors. This is more strategically valuable than almost any military arrangement. Fourth, the regional stabilization track. The Middle East will not stabilize through military victory alone. The history of the last 30 years has demonstrated that, conclusively. Stabilization requires a regional economic framework that gives the Gulf states, a post-regime Iran, and the broader Arab world a stake in order rather than chaos. Europe's energy security interests and China's oil import dependencies both align with Middle East stability in ways that could make them willing partners in reconstruction diplomacy, even after the fractures over the Iran operation. Water and food, the war trigger, hidden in plain sight. In January 2026, the United Nations formally declared that the world has entered an era of global water bankruptcy, not water stress, bankruptcy, meaning demand now permanently exceeds replenishment, and enough critical systems have crossed irreversible thresholds to constitute a planetary-scale condition. Let that sink in for a moment. Nearly 4 billion people, half the global population, live with severe water scarcity for at least 1 month every single year. The Indus Waters Treaty between India and Pakistan has been suspended. Ethiopia's Nile Dam is operational, with no binding downstream agreement, and China is building the world's largest dam with no treaty governing its effects on downstream nations. Tehran's political fragility, the Iran crisis we've been discussing, has a water dimension that almost nobody mentions publicly. Droughts and unsustainable water use have depleted the reservoirs. The Iranian capital depends on food insecurity as a direct recruitment pipeline for the kind of radicalization that makes regional stabilization impossible. Think about that connection for a moment. The war we've been fighting in the Middle East has a drought underneath it. When water scarcity undermines farming in one region, the effects travel through global commodity prices, through migration flows, and through political destabilization everywhere else. Every conflict zone we've discussed has a water dimension hiding behind the headlines. Any grand bargain that does not include a water and food security framework has a fatal blind spot. The demographic divergence. The major powers are aging at radically different rates, and this changes the strategic timeline in ways that most current analysis misses. Russia is in genuine demographic collapse. Its working-age population is shrinking. Its men are dying in Ukraine at catastrophic rates. It has no immigration pipeline to compensate. This makes Russia simultaneously more dangerous in the short term. A cornered, declining power tends toward aggression, and less threatening in the medium term. Russia simply will not have the population base to sustain great power ambitions past the 2030s. China faces a similar trajectory. The one-child policy created a demographic cliff that is now arriving. An aging, shrinking workforce will constrain China's economic growth and military capacity by the mid-2030s. This is why the window for Chinese adventurism is probably this decade. After that, the economics and the demographics make sustained military campaigns harder to sustain. Meanwhile, Africa and the Middle East have enormous youth bulges, with minimal employment prospects. When you map AI-driven job displacement onto a world where hundreds of millions of young people in unstable regions have no economic ladder to climb, you create a permanent recruitment pipeline for extremism that no military alliance can bomb its way out of. The dollar and the financial architecture. The US dollar's status as the world's reserve currency has been the foundational assumption of the post-World War II order. It gives the United States enormous leverage through sanctions, cheap borrowing, and control over the global financial messaging system. That leverage is being actively eroded. The Russia sanctions accelerated a trend among BRICS nations to build dollar alternative payment systems. China has been systematically building bilateral currency swap arrangements precisely to reduce dollar exposure. If the dollar loses meaningful reserve currency status, not suddenly, but gradually, the United States loses its most powerful non-military coercive tool and its ability to finance deficits cheaply. Think about what that means. Not a missile, not a cyber attack, not a war. Just a slow, deliberate migration away from the dollar by enough of the world's economies to matter. a U.S. fiscal crisis triggered by rising interest rates on $36 trillion in debt would be more destabilizing to the global order than almost any military conflict, because it would arrive without a clear adversary to negotiate with or deter. You can't sanction a bond market, you can't send a carrier group to a credit rating, and you can't bomb your way back to reserve currency status. Non-state actors, the power structures, nobody elected. The entire conversation about geopolitics is framed around nation-states. But the most significant structural shift of this era is the diffusion of meaningful power to non-state actors, and it is happening in two very different directions, simultaneously. On the destabilizing side, Mexican cartels now operate with the economic scale and territorial control of mid-sized nations. They function as a shadow governance layer across large parts of Latin America that directly affects U.S. border security, the fentanyl death toll, and the viability of any Western Hemisphere partnership. Any U.S.-Mexico strategic alliance that does not honestly address cartel power is built on sand. On the other side, technology oligarchs have accumulated geopolitical influence that rivals many nation-states. Elon Musk's Starlink terminal decisions literally determined battlefield outcomes in Ukraine. Not a general, not a president, not a treaty, a terminal decision by one man in one company. AI companies are writing the rules of an emerging technology domain, faster than any government can regulate. The relationship between sovereign states and these concentrated private technology powers is one of the most important and least theorized problems in contemporary geopolitics. Nobody voted for any of this. Cyber and space, the ungoverned escalation domains, the most likely path to accidental great power escalation in the near term, does not run through conventional military confrontation. It runs through cyber and space, two domains with no meaningful arms control treaties and no agreed escalation thresholds. None, not a single binding agreement for either domain. A cyber attack that takes down power grids or financial infrastructure could kill more people and cause more economic damage than a conventional military strike. But the attribution challenges and the absence of agreed response frameworks mean neither side has a clear playbook for how to react without accidentally triggering a kinetic escalation. You don't know who hit you. You don't know how hard to hit back. And you have about 72 hours before the situation decides itself. Anti-satellite weapons tests by China and Russia threaten the GPS, communications, and surveillance infrastructure that both civilian economies and military operations depend on. Take out the right satellites, and you don't just blind the military. You ground commercial aviation, you freeze financial markets, you cut off emergency services. Space is rapidly becoming the ultimate high ground, and the absence of governance there is arguably more dangerous than any of the conventional flashpoints we have discussed. Because an incident in space could cascade into a conflict that nobody intended to start. The most dangerous wars in history were not planned. They were stumbled into. And right now, in both cyber and space, we are stumbling in the dark. The disinformation infrastructure and democratic capacity, finally and perhaps most foundationally, every piece of the strategic architecture discussed in this video depends on democracies being able to make coherent, sustained, multi-year foreign policy decisions. That capacity is being systematically degraded. AI-generated disinformation is now operating at a scale and sophistication that is qualitatively different from anything that existed 5 years ago. Deepfakes of world leaders, synthetic news ecosystems, indistinguishable from legitimate outlets, algorithmic amplification of the most polarizing content at the expense of the most accurate content. Let that last one sit for a moment. The algorithm doesn't choose what's true. It chooses what makes you angry. And angry travels faster than accurate. These are not information problems. They are governance problems. A democracy that cannot agree on shared facts cannot sustain the kind of complex, multi-year, multi-party diplomatic commitments that a genuine global stabilization effort would require. And the adversaries in this fight are not only foreign states. They are domestic political actors. Private platforms optimizing for engagement over truth. And an AI industry racing to deploy capabilities faster than society can develop the immune response to handle them. The enemy in this domain is not wearing a uniform. It is not flying a flag. It is sitting in a server farm, optimizing a metric that has nothing to do with whether civilization holds together. So, let us bring this all together. We are living through a convergence of crises that is civilizational in scale, not merely geopolitical, or economic, or technological, but all of those things simultaneously, interactively, and at a speed that outpaces the tools governments currently have to respond. The political vacuum in the United States, the AI-driven hollowing of the middle class, the fracturing of the post-Cold War security architecture, the K-shaped global economy, the water and food stress, the demographic time bombs, the ungoverned technological domains. These are not separate problems. They are the same problem, viewed from different angles. The through line is this: every one of these challenges is, at its core, a coordination failure. The world is producing more than enough resources, technology, and human creativity to address all of them. What it lacks is the political architecture to coordinate a response at the necessary scale. The historical precedents for solving coordination failures of this magnitude are not encouraging in their details, but they are encouraging in their existence. The post-World War II order, the Bretton Woods institutions, NATO, the United Nations, the Marshall Plan, was built in the aftermath of catastrophic failure by leaders who had just watched civilization nearly destroy itself and were determined to build something that would prevent a recurrence. We do not have to wait for catastrophic failure. That is the difference between this moment and 1945. The tools of foresight, the data, the analytical capacity, the communications technology exist now to see what is coming before it arrives. What is required is a political generation willing to use those tools honestly, to say to their constituents, the problems we face are harder than a slogan, require more patience than an election cycle, demand sacrifice from people who are already exhausted, and will not be solved by any single country acting alone. That is not the politics of the current moment in any major democracy, but it was not the politics of 1945 either. The K-shaped economy can be bent if the major powers coordinate on AI governance and shared growth frameworks. It has never been tried at that scale, but neither had the Marshall Plan before it was. Kinetic war with China, Russia, and North Korea can be avoided, not through wishful thinking, but through a hard-headed understanding that all three of those governments have more to lose from war than from a negotiated order that respects their core interests. The windows for those negotiations exist right now. They will not remain open indefinitely. NATO can be reformed rather than abandoned, with Europe bearing its share of its own defense, and the United States maintaining the collective defense guarantee as the backstop it was always intended to be, not the full cost it has been allowed to become. The Middle East can be stabilized, not by military victory, but by a regional economic architecture that gives every actor a stake in order. It will require engagement with actors the United States finds distasteful. Every diplomatic achievement in history has. And the United States can find its political footing again, not through a third party necessarily, but through a realignment that honestly addresses what is actually happening to working people, what AI is actually doing to the economy, and what the world actually requires of the only country with the capacity to lead a global stabilization effort. None of this is inevitable. None of it is impossible. The difference between those two outcomes, catastrophe or transformation, is whether this generation of leaders and the citizens who hold them accountable chooses to close the gap between the tools available and the problems at hand. Slow down here. That choice is being made right now, in elections, in boardrooms, in parliaments, in the decisions of engineers building AI systems, in the negotiations happening or not happening between the world's great powers. History does not grade on a curve, but it does reward those who looked clearly at what was coming and acted.